Welcome to the Policy Forum and to South by Southwest EDU. I'm Liz Willen. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Hechinger Report. We're a nonprofit news outlet. We're based in New York City, which is, believe it or not, where I got these red cowgirl boots, and not here in Texas. And we write a lot about the issues we're going to talk about today, the lack of guidance counselors in this country, as well as the number of obstacles that are in the way of getting more Americans to and through college. And two of the panelists here with us represent two different poles of these issues. One, veterans, how we can help more veterans get to and through college, and what some of their obstacles are, and the lack of guidance counselors, which is also going to be featured in a film I'm moderating tonight called Personal Statement at 7 o'clock at the Alamo. So please come to that. So this panel arises from a lot of the work we've been doing over the years at the Hechinger Report on college completion. And much of it is around an Obama-era goal that we don't really talk about much anymore, and that's getting more students to and through higher education. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but before I introduce the panelists and the problems, I also want to encourage you to be part of the solution by asking questions of these panelists through a tool called Slido, which will pop up on your screen later. And here's how it works. You can open the app on your phone, or you can go to slido.com, enter the code SXSW EDU, and choose the correct room, which is 12AB, and it will show you how to work, because we're really hoping for a lot of good questions. So we've been writing about the problems we're going to discuss today for years here at the Hechinger Report, and figuring out how we could fix this problem of boosting the number of U.S. college graduates. It was a big initiative. We were going to restore the U.S. to first in the world in its proportion of population with the credentials needed to sustain an economy that's increasingly dependent on highly educated workers and where there's a real lack. How did it go? The answer is really not too well. A combination of federal and state budget cuts, spiraling tuition, political distraction, and increasing public skepticism just about the value of higher education has left us far behind from realizing this goal. Our two panelists have a lot of ideas on what we could do to help that. And I'm going to introduce them. To my left here is Jan Friese. She's the executive director of the Texas Counseling Association. And she does a lot of advocacy on behalf of professional counselors and coordination of their policy agenda. Those are her big priorities. And Jeremiah Gunderson is a director of veteran services in the Office of the Dean of Students at UT Austin. He oversees the operation of the student veterans offices there that serves about 2,000 students, but right now the number of veterans in each class is less than 400, correct?
Less than 500, about 450 student veterans on campus.
It's a tiny amount. He was named the 2018-19 Student Veteran Chapter Advisor of the Year, so he has had a lot of experience with helping them. And I'm going to start by asking Jeremiah a little bit about how your own experience as a veteran kind of motivated you to do this work you were doing. You did not go to college right away. You did not experience college success right away, did you?
That's a better way to put it. Yeah, I did not. I had a lot of success, but not with academics. So yeah, I went to college straight out of high school, like a lot of students do. Didn't do well. Had to leave, work, started a family. That I was married. I was married at the time. I had children. Then decided at some point to join the military to get the veteran education benefits. And my story is pretty common. With a lot of our veterans that we work with. Was in the Army for 6 years as a medic, deployed twice with the 4th Infantry Division to Iraq. And then upon exiting the military, went back to school at Texas A&M University, Central Texas. Much different academic experience that time. Ended up graduating, summa cum laude at that time with a bachelor's degree. Went on and got my master's and then started at UT, but used the GI Bill, went through the process as a student veteran. So I've been through it, been in the trenches, and
But you did notice a lot. You did find, even though you were more academically ready and more mature and ready to get your education, that you had a lot of obstacles in your way as a veteran. What did you encounter that kind of forced you to think about how to do this work now?
Right. A lot of the barriers are that there's not a lot of guidance. There's a lot of guidance out there for traditional students that go through what we call kind of the cookie-cutter approach to college. But anybody outside of that sphere, it doesn't get the same type of counseling, the same kind of advising. I was a first gen 62% of our veterans are first-generation college, so a lot of them don't really know what to do. They especially struggle with co-curricular, understanding internships and networking and those things they're supposed to do when they're in college to be successful when looking for a career. But they're also older. Our average veteran is 25 to 30 years old on campus. They don't really fit in on a more traditional campus like UT Austin. So that can be isolating, and we certainly see issues with that. A lot of existential issues that come from that. Why am I doing this? I'm 30 years old. This is silly. One of our Marine Corps infantry NCOs was leading troops in Fallujah. A year later, he's sitting in a college campus with a backpack next to a bunch of 18-year-olds. It's an identity shift that's difficult to overcome.
I imagine. And just getting them there in the first place requires a level of knowledge and counseling. And Jan, I think you find that as well with the many, many students that you're working with and the counselors that you represent work with all over the state. Tell us a little bit about what the typical caseload is for your counselors. Do they have the time and the opportunity to help college students with all that it takes to get into college? High school students, sorry.
High school students. So the Texas Counseling Association supports delivery of comprehensive school counseling programs, which is a system that defines how a school counselor should allocate their time. We actually think that if you really want to have post-secondary success, you need to have access to school counselors starting in the elementary school, because that is when you begin to open their hearts and minds, especially for students who are coming from families that have limited resources or communities that have limited resources. So it is very, very challenging here in the state of Texas because there is no mandate for a school to have a school counselor on campus.
How could that be?
There is no statutory mandate for a school because the legislature has chosen not to put that requirement into law. In Texas, you only have a principal or a teacher are the only two people who are required to be on a school campus. So you have a lot of campuses, especially in our small rural communities, that have no school counselor whatsoever. And then sadly, we also have a large number of campuses in our urban settings in Dallas and in Houston and not so much San Antonio, but in some of our larger settings where you also have no school counselor because the working conditions are really very, very, very challenging. Principals do not understand the components of comprehensive school counseling programs and how delivery of that model allows school counselors to allocate their time so that they can identify, identify students who are most in need and yet also lay eyes on and interact with all students in Texas.
Then how do they do the whole basic college application process, which I just went through twice in a row and found it to be hell on earth? How did they do it how do they encourage these students to do what they need to do? The forms, the FAFSA, the financial aid, the looking at colleges, the thinking about campuses, the recommendation letters, the essays, the personal statements. How do they do that without counselors?
And let's not forget the recommendation letters that all high school counselors are required to complete for all of their students. That's pretty aggressive as well. So it is an allocation of resources. And again, we go back to the delivery of the comprehensive school counseling program. So school counselors in a high school setting, for example, would do classroom guidance. And they would go into a classroom, and that's where you can reach hundreds of students in larger group settings where you begin to work with them on how do you find the application. In Texas, we have Common Application, which makes it a little bit easier. You have Texas FAFSA and federal FAFSA. We have a lot of competitions that go on to encourage participation. We have a number of resources that are available. So you do classroom guidance, then you do individual planning with the students. And in Texas, every high school student is required to have a meeting with their school counselor and their parent to figure out what they're going to do next. So that's individual planning. Responsive services are for crises. And system support is where a school counselor identifies additional resources in the community to help support that. So for example, they might partner with the PTA, they might partner with local church groups or with the Rotary or organizations like that, businesses that are very interested in mentoring and partnering and having those people come in. We see school counselors counselors at basketball games, helping people fill out their applications and trying to get the parents that can't get into the school in any other way. So there is a system in place. It is not perfect. But when schools utilize that system, school counselors have much greater reach into the student populations.
Jeremiah, even getting them to campus, since we're talking about here not just getting them to college, but through college and completion, veterans do not have a very high success rate of completing in many campuses in this country. What are some of the efforts underway to make their experience more manageable when they get there, so that they, you gave the image of sitting in this classroom with the 18-year-olds, and how do you get them to stay focused and stay with their education?
Well, believe it or not, that's actually a recent study by Student Veterans of America. They did a project they released in 2017. The assumption was that veterans were not completing at the same rates. But what they actually found, the project was called NVEST. They spent about $2 million on it, pulled all kinds of data from the clearinghouse, found out they're actually graduating at about the same rate as traditional students. So veterans are doing well. They're doing significantly better, 14% higher graduation rates than similar age adult learners. So they are much more driven. They are actually doing well on campus. But some of those barriers, we talked about admissions a little bit. When they get on campus, they just don't look like the other students. They're non-traditional students. So a lot of the systems in place aren't meant to work with students and dealing with childcare. That's one of the issues we hear over and over and over.
That's not just for veterans, that's for so many adult students and non-traditional
learners.
students.
That is correct. So a lot of the issues they're facing are similar to adult learners.
Is there anything that you've done particularly to help with that in Texas that you think has made a difference? Or
I think there's a few things that have made a big difference for us. One thing, we created a mentor program several years ago. Veterans are in the military. You're taught to kind of work with your peers. So you don't really. We have an open door policy, and we like to joke about it in orientation because nobody ever uses it. Because in the military, you kind of get in trouble. Everyone in your chain of command is going to get a talking to if you go use the open door policy. So we really leverage peer-to-peer support. So we created Hire Veterans. They're trained in Texas. The state has a military veteran peer network support program. We train them. They reach out. So as soon as students are admitted to the university, they're contacted by one of their peer mentors who work with them all the way through. We have a veteran-specific orientation on our campus at UT Austin. So the first day they're on campus, they're being pulled in. They're put into a cohort. They're meeting people, and we're building a network and a community. We have a very strong Student Veterans Association on our campus. Same thing. They build programming, support, events, and just a really strong community. And
that's
what we
unusual,
found.
though, from what I'm hearing about a lot of veterans end up at campuses where they feel incredibly isolated and they don't have that kind of support.
Well, we are fortunate. Obviously, I'm biased about our program. But, there isn't a lot out there, and I think a lot of campuses are still trying to catch up. We know it works. The problem is resources, and a lot of campuses just don't have it. And we were talking back there earlier, a lot of these programs that are in place have been in place since World War II. Campuses have had veteran support on campus, but they haven't really reevaluated that support in
But
a
didn't the
very long
Iraq
time.
War just unleash so many new veterans on campuses and change the landscape a bit?
Correct, and that's where our office came from, kind of during that influx of people coming to campus during the drawdown, about 2010 timeframe. Our office didn't even open until 2011. So we've only been there a few years trying to figure this out, and we really are building the plane as we fly it. We were fortunate enough, my colleague Jeff Moe is here. He's a counselor, a licensed clinical social worker with the VA. That's another program. We partner with them through an MOU. We were one of the first 5 schools in the country to have a program called VITAL, which embeds a licensed counselor from the VA that can work with students with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries and things like that on campus. We've seen an expansion, but we still only have 3 in the entire state of Texas, with the second highest veteran population in the country.
That's tiny. And as we were also talking about earlier, and Jan, you encountered this as well, when both veterans and high school students don't have the appropriate level of advice and counseling and support, they're often steered overwhelmingly to schools with lower success rates, including community colleges and including for-profit schools where they might be left in a lot of debt. Is there anything either of you are doing in your efforts to counter that and to make sure that they have the opportunity to take advantage of other educational opportunities that might serve them better? You want to start with that, Jan?
Yes. So I do want to, I think that one of the things that's really important, and I kind of before I touch on that, I want to mention a little bit about peer-to-peer kind of support. Because I think your point about having a peer experience, a peer who can help you navigate the system is very, very important. And in Texas, we do have an initiative through the Higher Education Coordinating Board to have what we call near peers. So recent high school graduates are partnering with oftentimes with the community colleges and with some universities to go back to the high schools that they graduated from and help those other students navigate their way. Very similar to the theme that we'll see in the movie tonight, you know, having students come in.
This is, again, if you came in late, the movie Personal Statement. It's showing tonight at the Alamo at 7 o'clock, and it's a great film on the guidance gap, so we'll be talking a lot about it there and afterwards.
So peer-to-peer is very, very effective, but again, there are very limited resources in order to implement these programs across the state. I think, again, having access to your school counselors early in your decision-making process. So beginning in elementary school to do career exploration and to do career pathways, to figure out where and how, if you want to become a veteran, a veterinarian, maybe what you do is become a vet tech first and you move through and you walk up through that. So we have a number of initiatives in Texas. Texas OnCourse is a system that trains. It's an online program that works with school counselors to help deliver resources. They've been doing a huge initiative to reach directly to the students. And then, of course, the big concern is once these kiddos get into these programs, giving them the resources that they need to support them. And tragically, as large as the counselor to ratio is in elementary schools, in public schools, anywhere from 470 to 950
to one student.
The ratio in a community college or a university setting can be as high as 1,900 to 2,000 to one student. So when you have students who are first generation students going into the system, it's scary. And even if you are in the top 10 of your school in, Del Rio, when you come into the University of Texas in Austin, there are a lot of top 10s, and everybody can't be top 10 when you get into the school. Somebody's going to be bottom 10. And I think a huge challenge is not only getting our kids into post-secondary opportunities, but creating the pathways and the resources to support them and keep them there once they get there. It's an issue for our veteran population. It's an issue for our first-generation populations. It's an issue for our teen parents. It's a national issue.
It is, and it's something we write about a lot at the Hechinger Report. Although yesterday I was at a panel on first-generation students, and it was really compelling listening to their stories and hearing what's happening. One of them who was at Barnard was also talking about how it had changed in the last 4 years. That there's been an increasingly, she's now in her 5th year, and it's having taken some time off, and there's found an increasing recognition that specific targeted support and help for students from low-income families and first-generation families was absolutely needed for their success. But it feels like we've been very slow in recognizing those steps. Tell me a little bit about how you have what you've done with veterans. It seems like it's very specific and targeted at your school, but I don't know that that's the case elsewhere in the country.
Well, that's a broad question. I know that for students overall, just to speak to the overall issue at UT, we have the Longhorn Center for Academic Excellence that works with the students that come from the Valley and some of the underprivileged areas to really help those students meet the other students when they get to campus, and that's been great. I know one thing that we do, we actually have training sessions for our advisors. So we work with advisors to help them understand the issues, to help them advise better. We understand some of the issues facing veterans. We've seen a decrease on our campus, what we call BCAL calls, where it's like an emergency. Hey, this person seems upset. I feel threatened. We don't really get those anymore. We've built a better line of communication on our campus, a better understanding, which has really helped. And when academic counselors understand the GI Bill and some of the issues that face veterans, so when they're advising that student, they're giving them better advice because they're understanding the implications of the decisions they make can impact them financially and even potentially put them out of school. You know, in admissions as well, we work with admissions to help them understand the issues, and we've worked with them carefully because our veterans don't always look like all the other students who apply, and when they go into the machine, it does.
They're older.
They're older. The story I like to tell, we have a student, phenomenal student. She's actually the president currently of our Student Veterans Association on campus. She applied to UT with 127 credit hours from 7 institutions as a transfer student. Denied across the board everything she applied to. Fortunately, someone took a chance on her in our astronomy program. By the end of her first year, she was published in astrophysics as an undergrad. And now she's a doctoral candidate in their astrophysics program. So just a phenomenal student and a great story, but somebody, and I could tell you a dozen more, where these students would have been missed in the more traditional look. So taking a look at that, you talked about something that we do as well. 85, this is a number I was told, but 85% of our students apply to nursing, engineering, and business. That's across the board at UT. So what we've tried to do is steer students in other directions. Let's talk about your goal, and let's talk about some alternative ways to reach that goal without having to go down, because the goal is to get them in the door and then help them be successful along the way.
And help them get out the door.
Yeah, well, definitely.
Both of you are very involved in solutions or in looking for ways to improve the opportunities for the population you deal with. Jeremiah, you're going off to D.C. to testify later in the week before a Senate committee, and Jan, you've been back and forth all week doing this. Can you each, before we open up to questions, tell us a little bit about the specific solutions that you're working on and towards?
I guess I'll start this time. My turn. You know, we call it reshaping the narrative, and there's a lot of stigma attached to veterans, and unfortunately, that is a lot of stigma that we've had to overcome. It's assumed political assumptions, religious assumptions. It's assumed, I swear, I don't go to a single meeting where they don't ask us about guns. They assume every veteran owns a dozen guns. It's not necessarily true. We like to say if you've met one veteran, you've met one veteran. They're very different. They each have their own ideas and goals. Someone asked me once, how do you measure veteran success? I said, well, I asked them, you know, how do they measure it? Because that's what we're there to help with. And so it really is about relationship, we've found, and understanding. We know our veterans, we know their names, we know their families, their kids, what their goals are, and then we try to tailor their educational experience around that. Again, it's a little easier with our system, you know, having so few veterans,
very personalized
and so many
approach.
resources, but a very personalized approach to it, rather than, you know, these top macro level approaches. It's very much peer-to-peer support. It's on the ground, and along with our counseling programs, we have scholarships that we've gotten from outside foundations. We have an emergency fund, which is extremely beneficial. We're fortunate enough to have about $50,000 every year we can use as discretionary funding for veterans that run into financial emergencies, and really help with those issues. And what we've found, we created a Venn diagram where you've got mental health, you've got existential issues, financial issues, family issues. And what we found is if you don't address each of those, it's going to touch all the other ones. And then that student is going to fail. So we've really tried to create a one-stop center on campus where when a student comes in, we can address each of these issues and try to solve those with the student before they leave.
Jen, can you imagine if you had something like that in every high school?
Wow. It would just be amazingly awesome. You know, it's interesting when you talk about the Venn diagram. So this morning I was at a hearing of the Senate Education Committee, and they're considering Senate Bill 11 for you Texans. Please support it. Senate Bill 11 is a school safety bill. And, you know, as many of you might recall, last May we had the just horrific school shooting down in Santa Fe. And the president of the school board was testifying this morning. And as he was going through the different iterations of what do you do to help students and families feel safe. And, you know, certainly there was quite a bit of talk about school hardening. But even he concluded, and I say even he because as the president of the school board, he has a huge responsibility to keep students physically safe. But even he talked about the fact that the emotional trauma that the students experienced and the families experienced completely interfered in their ability to continue to pursue their studies and to pursue the pathways that they might have chosen. So we're pretty pleased with Senate Bill 11 and who is sponsoring it and the support that it has so far. It will include a school counselor loan repayment program for school counselors who go to work in school districts that are located in our over 200 of 254 counties in Texas are designated as mental health workforce shortage areas. And so you get a loan repayment program if you're a school counselor and you're working in a Title I school or you're working in those settings. It also has some details in there regarding increased access to school counselors, including school counselors in a school safety plan, which I think is really, really important because school counselors are academic counselors, but they're also mental health professionals too. And so they bring the balance of that. We have another piece of legislation that would require a school counselor spend a minimum of 80% of their time delivering comprehensive school counseling programs. This is a strategy to help get them out of doing data entry. There is no reason that a school counselor is putting the data in for the course selections. Yes, school counselors should help students figure out what their interests are in career paths and looking for different pathways where they could be as successful and maybe even feel better about their post-secondary options. But they shouldn't be loading those classes into the master schedule. They should be then spending that time going on with that kid, helping them complete their FAFSA or their application. So those are two bills. We have another piece of legislation that would keep school counselors from participating on disciplinary committees at the school so students feel safe going to them, and a bill that will be introduced this afternoon to lower the ratio of school counselor to student to 250 to 1.
250 to 1 sounds a lot better than what it is, but that's still really difficult. When you visit a typical counselor, maybe in one of those rural schools or whatever, what do you see? Do they seem very overwhelmed to you? It's a hard job.
It's a very, very difficult job. But again, and I hate to sound like a broken record and like I don't have stock in comprehensive school counseling programs. I really don't.
I don't know if anybody actually understands what that is.
Okay, so a comprehensive school counseling program is essentially the curriculum for a school counseling program on a campus. And a school counselor will go in and take a look at the demographics of that, look at this campus strategic plan, look at the high priorities, meet with principals, teachers, parents, and students to identify what the priorities are for that campus, and then we'll allocate their 40-hour week into one of 4 components. The first component is classroom guidance, where they go into classrooms and teach. The second is individual planning, where they meet one-on-one with students or parents to develop specific pathways, course selections, post-secondary opportunities, sometimes identify some emotional challenges. Responsive services, which happen not only when there's a crisis on a campus, like in Santa Fe, but also when you know there might be a crisis, when you know that a student is living in a household that sells drugs or is engaged in some other illegal activities, or where there are not really responsible adults in the house for 40 hours a week. That's a responsive service where you go in. School counselor works with that student and helps them develop strategies for what are they going to do when the crisis hits. You know, what's their escape plan, basically. Responsive services are done in small groups, and then they are also done one-on-one. School counselors also from responsive services will refer to other mental health professionals either on the school campus or at the local mental health authorities or communities. And then system support is a really big one because it's the school counselor's job to then pull everything together and identify what else do we need and who else can I talk to School counselors oftentimes teach mental health first aid and work with teachers on behavior management issues. They'll also work with teachers. For example, many school counselors will use classroom guidance to have students begin their work on their personal essays. So that's how you get a counselor who's got 500 kids helping them work on their personal essays, because they go in August the first day, and then by the time those essays are due in January, that essay's been through a lot of iterations and review. It becomes part of the English curriculum. So we know, research has shown that when principals allow school counselors to do their job and allocate their time in these 4 core areas, that students and teachers report that they feel safer, grades go up, disciplinary referrals go down, and the pursuit of post-secondary opportunities also increase. So I am like a broken record about comprehensive school counseling programs. It is in statute in Texas. We have the Texas model for comprehensive school counseling programs. And yet, even though it's in statute, there's no requirement for a school, as I said earlier, to have a school counselor. And principals and superintendents are not required to learn about this program as part of their training. So we have this other hump, but I do see the state of Texas tragically in response to the horrific event that took place in Santa Fe last May, but they are looking very, very hard at strategies to increase students' access to counseling services, not only for their psychosocial and emotional needs, but because they are beginning to understand that if kids don't feel secure, if they don't feel calm, if they don't feel competent and respected, they are not in a place where they can take those rigorous courses and complete those applications.
Totally understood. And Jeremiah, before we get to questions, it seems that you have figured out a lot of things at the flagship campus, but the level of support that you describe, that's not typical elsewhere in the state or elsewhere in the country, is it?
Unfortunately, no, and we wish we could replicate that model everywhere. You know, my priority first is to see our veterans succeed across the country, and I think that people are starting to catch up, schools are starting to catch up, states are starting to catch up. There's a lot of other programs across the country similar to ours. The model seems to be working. We talked about earlier, there is no degree you can go get for Veteran Services Director. We kind of have to make this up as we go, and we learn by failing forward. And seeing what works and what doesn't.
Got it. And we have a related question around that.
Okay.
Someone would like to know how you help students navigate the variety of options presented to them and ensure that they are choosing a quality school.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's also another issue that is happening on a macro level. On the Air Force, I think, has done a phenomenal job of this with the Community College of the Air Force. Other branches were lagging a little bit behind, but I know the Army is working on a program now where they're more focused on creating a professional soldier, airman, Marine, sailor, so that when they get out, they have better options. When I got out, it's really unfortunate. My colleagues would share this. You'd go to a career fair, and it was a bunch of for-profit schools, for-profit programs, or you could be a truck driver or work on an oil rig, and that was your option as an enlisted person. There was also a lot of disparity between the opportunities for officers and enlisted. I was enlisted, I was an NCO in the Army, whereas officers already have degrees and there's a system in place. They're not first gen predominantly. Enlisted people didn't have as much guidance. And so I think on the military, still on active duty side, they're doing a lot to improve that, but we can't help them unless they find us. And I think that's so important. If there are veterans out there, we're trying to create a network where they can, rather than getting bad advice from their buddies or their cousins, sisters, uncles, friends, where they're finding out afterward they missed a lot of key decisions along the way that would have made them successful. And it's unfortunate, but now they're going to have to look at other options other than UT. And, we try to mitigate that where we can.
By the way, I'm also going to invite people to come up to the mic that's in the front of the room and ask questions. But there's a really good question here that I would love to, Jan, for you to tackle. This is a really good question. In talking about the lack of counselors in schools, how much of that is about a lack of jobs? People don't want to do this, don't want to get the degree because they don't think there are enough jobs, or is it a lack of pay? What makes it not attractive to draw enough people? Or do we even have enough counselors to fill that ratio? Are they not being filled because of the decisions, or because they don't exist? The qualified positions don't even exist.
Well, that's a complicated, complicated question, but I think that clearly, I did a little, to prepare for my testimony before the committee today, I did a quick little survey and looked at 125 school districts. Now, Texas has close to 2,000 school districts, but out of 125 school districts, over 50 of them had less than one counselor, one or less than one counselor. So there are employment opportunities. Compensation and budget decisions is a huge factor in their determination to do that.
Did you say there were raises yesterday given to other school personnel that did not include counselors?
Yes. The Senate passed their first legislation of the session, their first bill, Senate Bill 3. And Senate Bill 3 will give every classroom teacher in Texas and every librarian in Texas a $5,000 salary increase from state funds. Essentially, it's creating a new formula. Although school counselors in Texas are also required to hold a certificate as a classroom teacher, school counselors were not included in that, and the argument from the bill's sponsor was that it just costs too much money. There are currently 12,000 working school counselors across the state of Texas. There are approximately 20,000 certified school counselors in the state of Texas. And our argument and big concern about the fact that school counselors were not included in that salary increase is that in our small and rural school districts, school counselors are not making very much money, as classroom teachers are not making very much money. But those school counselors, as hard as it is to be a classroom teacher, it's 10 times harder to be a school counselor. You heard me describe what their job description is. And so,
that sounds terrifying, actually.
Well, it's very scary because we think an unintended consequence of the good intention of raising classroom teachers' salaries is that we will see even fewer school counselors, especially in those rural districts where getting a $5,000 increase could mean the difference between you working at school all day and then go working at McDonald's at night. If you go back into the classroom. So we are very concerned. The good news is we never give up, and legislation has to pass the Senate and the House and go to the governor, so we're early in the process and we're still fighting for it.
Got it. Would anyone in the audience like to come up to the mic and ask a question? I can go through these, but I do welcome them as long as you step up to the mic and please address it to one of the panelists. Don't be shy. Okay, while you're thinking about your questions, we have some more here. Somebody is asking specifically about, you mentioned a lot about the lack of counselors in rural and urban areas. And there's somebody in the audience who's very interested in what's going on in San Antonio and what's different there compared to other urban areas. Any sense on that?
Well, San Antonio, for those of you from Texas, San Antonio is kind of the gateway from the valley up into the northern part of the state. San Antonio area probably in and of itself has 8 or 9 school districts that are in the area there. And the reason I said I wasn't so sure that San Antonio was experiencing as drastic a shortage of school counselors as Houston and Dallas, for example, is because the data that I've looked at hasn't indicated that. I think in some of the smaller school districts that you see in the periphery of, like maybe Northeast, ISD, some of the smaller school districts that are outside downtown or the center or the suburban part of San Antonio, they might have some trouble recruiting school counselors. But San Antonio, one of the differences in San Antonio is that there are at least 3 universities that produce school counselors. So when you have that many universities that have graduate programs for school counselors, and now we have the loan repayment program to help encourage people to go into school counseling, I think that that's the difference that I would say in San Antonio as opposed to some of the other urban parts of Texas.
Interesting. Question right here. Can you please identify yourself?
Well, how should I identify it? Just my name, or?
That's good enough.
Okay, hi. I'm Jonathan, and I posted the latest question, but one of the things I was wondering is, like, what can technology do to solve this problem?
We are at South by Southwest, and you knew that question was going to come up. The tech solution. Is there a tech solution?
Yes.
Trying to think of a good tech solution that we've, you know, one thing we proposed a few years ago we'd love to explore more, and I'd like to see more of, and this isn't just veterans, but also other non-traditional students, and also, you know, students on the spectrum with autism and things like that. Like, we looked at some virtual reality programs. We proposed that a few years ago, so somebody could do a virtual orientation of campus and feel more comfortable before they get there, so they're not just coming into this new environment. Can be overwhelming for a lot of students and can be a barrier to higher ed for some students. Also, you know, a lot of our generation is older. They aren't millennials. They aren't as comfortable with technology, so we've had to do a lot with training them and helping them understand technology, so they can just crash course into this, coming off of the military. I mean, we have people literally sign out of their unit, and 2 or 3 weeks later, they're on campus. And so things have changed a lot.
How about some virtual counselors, Jan? Would that work?
Well, yes and no. So there is a great deal of technology. One of the programs that I mentioned when I started is Texas OnCourse. If you are interested in this subject, I would highly recommend that you Google them. They're actually housed out of UT. It was a program that was initiated a couple of years ago to enhance the professional development of school counselors in college and career readiness. And so they have a plethora of online programs that students can use to do virtual college visits. Virtual college visits are very, very effective ways, especially for some of our students in the rural areas who can't get around the country or even get around the state. So school counselors do a lot of virtual college visits. There's also a lot of technology that's being developed so that school counselors can develop better dashboards, so that as students are being referred to them, there's an internal tracking system. I'm not going to name any because they're all out there, and it's you know, open market, and I'm not endorsing any product. But there are a number of systems that school counselors are beginning to use. And then another way that we've been implementing that I'm not a school counselor, I just represent them, but another system strategy that they are using is actually going in and having a, you know, application. We're all going to go into the computer lab, and we're all going to complete the unified application for all the schools in Texas, and we're all going to begin the FAFSA. And then there's most of our districts have technology that then allow the school counselors to keep track of where students are in their application process. And either they go back to the student, or again, they will use their near peer or peer advisors. You know, and I think it's important that we call them advisors because they're not counselors. Counselors have such a wider depth of training to be able to work with kiddos who get in trouble. But when you're talking about filling out the application or just getting the timeline, or you know what, how do you get your parents to give you their income tax information when the whole culture of certain populations is that is extremely private information, and they're not going to share it with anybody. So to have students who come from those family situations to talk about how they trick or get their mom or dad to go ahead and submit that information. So but using technology, bringing kids together in group settings, and then identifying the ones who need that one-on-one. Those are some of the ways that we're using technology for a counselor who's got 950 kids to get into college.
I wanted to mention too before, we also have leveraged, my colleague, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. We're looking at options as well for telehealth and telepsychiatry, mental health services on our campus so that students don't have to leave campus. Anybody from Austin understands that as the crow flies, our clinic is down by the airport. That's a significant drive in the middle of the day for a student to have to leave campus to go receive those services. And a lot of them will just avoid doing it because they can't afford to miss class. We don't ever want to see that happen. So we're looking at ways we can leverage technology to make that easier for the student.
Fair enough. Question?
Yes. So I posted, but I wanted to expand on that a little bit. So I've worked with TRIO and Gear Up programs for about 17 years, focus on college programming, college readiness for pre-college students, but also have programs like Veterans Upward Bound, Talent Search serves veterans as well. So programs like that all have the same objectives that you do, trying to get students into higher education, whether that's certification, 2-year programs, 4-year programs. How can we better partner with school counselors, veterans programs that are already in existence? You know, we're all trying to get the same objectives, but sometimes it feels like we're sort of competing against each other. And so what are sort of best practices or ways that we can all pool our resources and our skills and our staffing to meet those objectives?
So I'd like to start just by saying a strategy that the Texas Counseling Association, the Texas School Counselor Association has implemented, and that is that we offer a conference every year. We just had our conference for school counselors in San Antonio. We had over 2,000 counselors there. We invite Gear Up to come and to present and to exhibit so that...
What's Gear Up for those of us who may not know?
So Gear Up, I think you should describe Gear Up.
It's a federal program just like TRIO is. It stands for Gaining Early Awareness for Undergraduate Programs, or Early Awareness and Readiness for Undergraduate Programs. Does the same kind of thing, works with grades 7 through 12, to educate them about college options, and then make sure they're ready for those options. And then starting now, see that the issue is that we can't just get them ready and get them there. We have to continue to support them while they're there so that they stay.
And so these programs are targeted at students who are unlikely candidates to pursue post-secondary educational opportunities. So I will tell you, many school counselors come through the Gear Up program. They come on to Gear Up, and then they decide that they love it so much they go on to become school counselors. And so then there are always good partnerships there. The Texas Education Agency just restructured how they're functioning, how they're delivering Gear Up services in the state, and they just did a focus group to try to identify more effective strategies to do that. They did some focus groups with our school counselors. But I think the best way, the best way is the personal way. If you're working in a Gear Up program on a campus, I would recommend you find the school counselor, go to the school counselor meetings, partner with the school counselors. If you don't have a school counselor, then you need to go to the PTA. You need to go to classroom teachers and make sure that you are getting in front of the people who can make the difference. And for us, we found parents to be amazing allies in the promotion of school counseling programs.
I think for us, I mean, the Veteran Upward Bound program is a good program where we have more of a homegrown version of it, but we've seen it be effective on other schools. And I think just promoting that legislatively, encouraging programs like that on campuses, because it's shown to work. The more support a veteran has, and students in general have, non-traditional students have, first-gen students have, empirically it's shown to keep them on campus, and they're graduating at higher rates.
This is a question also that I really like because it backs us up a step. And it's really important. It's an issue we've been writing about a lot at the Hechinger Report. So we talk about getting students to and through higher education, and we're falling short, et cetera. But how do you balance getting students into higher education when there are alternatives like the trades and job-relevant skills that may pay higher and that may not leave them drowning in debt? That's an argument that has to be made as well. So I'm curious how both of you address that and how much that comes up, both for veterans and for high school students.
Well, with veterans, I think that they have so much relevant skill that a lot of times maybe it's not best for them to go to a liberal arts college and get a degree and incur a lot of debt. I think the GI Bill is a strong draw for a lot of veterans. Like I said, they get a monthly stipend, which can be equivalent to a salary in a lot of cases. But I think if we had a lot of bridge programming, if things like that could be created to take those relevant skills from the military. I was a medic, can we take that relevant skill? But, I like to tell the story. I could do surgery in the Army and have, but I wasn't even qualified to draw blood when I stepped off of active duty. So can we create bridge programs to push those people with that real life experience? I think that's great. I don't think it's always best for a student to come to our campus, and that's a conversation that we have and steer them in another direction. They'll make
And
them
Jan,
more
not all
successful.
a college might not be the best for all students, or are the counselors trained to encourage that regardless?
Professional school counselors are trained to help students identify their interests, their ability, their opportunities, and that's why we talk about post-secondary success, because post-secondary success means anything that you do once you have gotten out of high school. There are situations, you have to be very, very careful, because there are students who really, they should not be in a four-year institution, and to be in a four-year institution can have catastrophic impact. You see a lot of suicide, a lot of cutting, a lot of hurting. It's very, very tragic. And that's why I said we recommend that the beginning to explore what your career pathway is going to be should really start in elementary school. In elementary school, school counselors should be holding career days at least once a year, if not 2 or 3 times a year. It's kind of ironic, many elementary school counselors find that they are giving college application and financial advice to the parents of their students, because they come to school for career day and they have these opportunities. But you do career exploration in Texas. We had a program for a long time called Achieve Texas, which really allows kiddos early on to go through and identify what their interests are, and then what are the array of opportunities. Texas is experiencing a huge shortage in professionals who are moving into the trades. We don't have enough plumbers, electricians, construction workers, and we're booming. So oftentimes,
And they pay better than
and they
probably
pay
than school counselors,
better.
right?
You have plumbers. We work in partnership with the trades, and they exhibit at our conferences and present at our conferences as well, because oftentimes you can have a plumber who, thought the kids were going to come into the business. They're not. It's a booming business in a small community. They'll pay the apprenticeship program. They'll pay for a kid to go to community college if they commit to work. They finish that, and they're making $70,000 a year. That's not a bad pathway. I think when we talk about this, it's important that we talk about getting our kids into college, but what we really want is for them to be emotionally and economically successful so that they can be full participants in our society. And that looks different for everyone. And that's why I love my job, to support and promote school counselors, because I think they see the uniqueness in each individual and don't push them down a path, but help them uncover the path that's best for them.
Do we have any questions up at the mic? Please.
Hi, my name is Jacob, and I'm with College Houses. You mentioned advisors earlier. I work with the Texas College Advising Corps, part of the National College Advising Corps. So thinking about your comment on funding earlier and getting adequate funding for counselors, I wondered if structurally there are any best practices for partnership programs coming into schools to make sure that they aren't diminishing the attention to the need to adequately provide resources for counselors, if that makes sense. Not coming in to replace jobs or distract from the current needs, but to be a good partner and make sure that you're coming in. For example, I know with our program, if the school removed the person in the college advising position, then the agreement was often person coming in. But if you have anything you can expand on that, or if anyone has broader insights.
Yeah, I worked with the coordinating board pretty closely when they started that program because, it's like you succeed by failing. So there were a bunch of stutter steps around that, and part of the agreement that if the school counselor, the person who is supervising your peer, your academic advisor, is removed, then the position is removed. And so we worked with the coordinating board to ensure that funds were either matching or, and so that you didn't have a supplanting. Because when school districts are struggling to fund these positions and get well qualified, I mean, every school counselor in the state of Texas, like I said, 2 years of classroom teaching experience and at least one master's degree. Many of them have a couple and many have doctorates. That's a huge bill to pay. So making sure you don't supplant it by doing partnerships, requiring a structure in place so that those individuals are supervised by a school counselor, those are excellent strategies.
I don't really have a dog in that hunt as far as the hiring and retention, but one thing I think we've done to be successful is our training program with our advisors, and we like to call it our focusing on a proactive approach, the little c versus big C crisis. If we can get out ahead of these issues, before they become major issues through training and having better equipped advisors, then it actually reduces their workload in a lot of ways because now they're not having to deal with these major crises. So I think that's something that's lost a lot. And in our world as well, what can we do to be proactive to take care of the issues when they're smaller and much more manageable and utilize the resources that we have better?
Finally, a really relevant question here, and we have not talked about student debt a lot in this, and yet it's a huge issue in higher education. It is one of the main obstacles for many Americans who are not getting to and through college. So this is a question about counseling, how much counseling goes on for financing a degree, both a college degree and graduate programs, and for veterans and also for high school students. If these counselors are so overwhelmed with such terrible ratios, and how are they able to, and since veterans are so often steered to for-profit schools where they amass enormous debt, and they may not have enough advice about that in advance, how can we be more savvy about counseling geared towards keeping students out of enormous debt? Let's start with you, Jeremiah, and veterans.
Well, fortunately, with the GI Bill students, our students are incurring much less debt than their peers. They don't have to use loans. A lot of them will just use the GI Bill and then Pell Grants. And then other grant funding, so they're not graduating with quite as much debt. But
If they choose for-profit schools, they are, though. Often.
That may be true. That may be the
Very
case.
often.
And I know that nationally, there's been a lot of stories about that, the closure of some schools that impacted veterans. Unfortunately, there was a bill created to refund that GI Bill money to those students. Again, the best we can do is just really work with them if they contact us, but I think that there needs to be a better job done on the other end while they're still on active duty to guide them, better guidance. Really, again, letting the veteran themselves define success and then guiding them in a direction that's going to make them the most successful. That's how we've overcome it.
Jan?
So in Texas, they have passed some legislation that requires the inclusion of financial literacy into the core curriculum in high school. And I think that, so that aspect is actually taught probably in your math classes. So, and financial literacy includes not just college debt, but all debt, and how do you create a budget? How do you balance a budget? And again, school counselors, when they are working with students to identify what is the best pathway for them, they're looking at what their interests are, what their financial resources are, trying to get them the most financial aid as possible. School counselors especially high school counselors, are always trolling for dollars, looking for scholarship opportunities, pushing their students to apply. And again, it's very similar. I mean, you can push and push and push. But again, the students and their parents have to decide that this is something that they really want them to pursue. So I would say the school counselor's role in this is keeping track of the timing through their dashboards, doing those large group settings, doing individual planning with parents, and then monitoring as they go forward.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We have to wrap up now, so I want you to please appreciate these great panelists and their insights.